There is a particular kind of disrespect that arrives in a calm voice. It doesn't pound the table. It doesn't shout. It sits across from you in your own kitchen, folds its hands, and tells you what is going to happen in your own house, as if the decision has already been made, and your only role left is to accept it with dignity. That was how Miles Carver told me his parents were moving in. Not asked, not suggested, told. It was a Thursday evening in late October, and the three of us were sitting at my kitchen table in Roanoke, Virginia, finishing a pot roast my daughter had made and brought over in one of my old enamel roasting pans. Hannah did that sometimes, brought dinner, straightened things that did not need straightening, stood in my kitchen and acted like she still knew every cabinet by instinct, which she did. I had raised her in rooms that smelled like sawdust and paint thinner and coffee. Some things stay in the body after the mind stops calling them up on purpose. I kept my face even and poured myself more coffee. The house itself was the sort of house a man spends a lifetime earning. Not large by modern standards, just right. A 1919 American four-square with a broad front porch, deep eaves, old heart pine floors, and a workshop behind it that had once been a carriage shed before I rebuilt it board by board. I had spent nearly 3 years restoring the place after I retired. New wiring, new plumbing, original trim stripped and stained by hand, window weights repaired instead of replaced, kitchen cabinets built in my workshop because I did not like the look of anything sold in stores. Every room in that house had passed through my hands more than once. I knew which boards creaked in winter. I knew where the afternoon light landed in October. I knew exactly how much the porch swing would drift if a person sat in the right-hand corner. Miles set down his fork and spoke in the tone men use when they think sounding reasonable is the same thing as being right. His parents, Richard and Paula, had hit a rough patch. Richard's hip replacement had been harder than expected. Their rent had jumped in Knoxville. Paula had picked up some extra shifts at the dental office where she worked reception, but it wasn't enough. They needed something stable for a while. I had 4 bedrooms. Hannah and Miles had a 2-bedroom apartment in South Roanoke. The arithmetic in his head was obvious. Hannah didn't interrupt him. She just watched me with that careful expression I had learned to read over 35 years of being her father, and for most of those years, her only parent. Her mother, Lila, had died when Hannah was 6. A burst aneurysm on a Tuesday morning that divided my life cleanly into before and after. Since then, it had been Hannah and me and whatever work I could find with my hands. "How long?" I asked. Miles waved a hand as if time were a flexible inconvenience. 6 months, maybe 8, just until Dad is fully mobile and they can get their footing again. I nodded once, slowly, the way I nod when I am standing in front of a run of trim trying to see where the cut actually belongs. "That's a large ask," I said. "It's family," Miles said. He made the word sound polished, pre-finished, something he had used often enough that he trusted it to do labor for him. I looked at Hannah. She dropped her eyes to her plate. That told me more than anything else had. She had known this was coming. Maybe not the exact wording, maybe not the exact evening, but she had known. I told them I would think about it. Miles smiled. That was what I noticed most. He smiled the way a man smiles when he hears confirmation, not delay. Hannah looked relieved. They helped me with the dishes. Hannah dried. Miles stacked plates without really seeing what he was touching. Then they drove home, and I stood at the kitchen window with my coffee and watched the red taillights pull away from the curb and vanish down Maple Avenue. I was not thinking about it. I had already decided. But I spent 32 years as a Finnish carpenter and remodeler, and one of the first things that trade teaches you is that the decision is rarely the most important part. Preparation is. You can make the right decision and still lose if you make it sloppily. So I called my old friend Stephen Mallory the next morning. Stephen and I had known each other since 1996, when he was a baby-faced associate attorney in scuffed shoes, and I was trying to keep a subcontractor from cheating me on a church renovation. He had more gray now and better suits. I had less hair and better instincts. Between us, we had gotten older without getting foolish. He picked up on the second ring. "Walter Grady," he said. "Either you're in trouble or I'm about to be." "I need advice." "Good. Trouble pays better than small talk. Come by Monday." That weekend, I documented everything. Not because I was frightened, because I had spent my whole adult life learning what happens to men who trust memory over records. On a yellow legal pad, I wrote down the date, the time, where we had been sitting, what was served for dinner, and the exact words Miles had used. Not close approximations. Exact. The confidence in his tone. Hannah's silence. The way he had moved from his father's surgery to the square footage of my house without ever once asking what I wanted. Then I started a fresh notebook. Monday morning, Stephen's office smelled like old paper and stale coffee. He listened without interrupting, which is one of the reasons I have always trusted him. Men who interrupt too soon are usually more interested in their opinion than your problem. When I finished, he leaned back and asked me one question. "Did you say yes?" I said I'd think about it. "That is not yes." "I'm aware." He nodded. Then he explained something I had half known and never needed to test. In Virginia, if somebody established residence in your home without a written lease but with enough evidence of occupancy, removing them could become a slow, ugly business. Not impossible. Just expensive and time-consuming in the exact way that drains decent people into bad compromises. "So I prevent occupancy," I said. "You prevent entry," he said. He drafted a formal no trespass notice while I sat across from him. We arranged for a civil standby through the sheriff's office for the following Saturday. That was the day Miles had casually mentioned his parents would probably come up with the truck. Not if, with. Stephen glanced up from the draft and said, "Do you think he'll push?" I thought about the smile, the smoothness of the word family, the way men like Miles were always most certain when they had mistaken somebody else's restraint for weakness. "Yes," I said. "I do." "Then document everything from here forward," Stephen said. "Texts, calls, voicemails, dates, times. Keep the record cleaner than his." I drove home and installed a camera system that same afternoon. 4 cameras, front porch, driveway, side gate, rear workshop entry. I had wired security systems into homes more complicated than mine back when people still paid cash and offered coffee in foam cups. It took me 2.5 hours. By dusk, I could see my own front steps from 3 different angles on my phone. Hannah called Wednesday evening. Her voice was light in the way voices get when they are carrying something heavy underneath and hoping tone will compensate. She said she was just checking in, that Richard and Paula were so grateful that she had been thinking maybe Sunday she could come by and help them settle into one of the back rooms. One of the back rooms, as if the matter had moved past decision and into logistics. I kept my voice steady. "I'll see you Saturday," I said. There was the smallest pause on the line. Then she laughed and said, "Of course, Saturday." After we hung up, I stood in my kitchen and let myself feel the full weight of it. My daughter had assumed my compliance. Not requested it, not confirmed it, assumed it. Thursday morning, I confirmed the civil standby with the Roanoke County Sheriff's Office. 2 deputies, private property matter, 2 o'clock Saturday. I reviewed Stephen's paperwork that evening and again Friday after dinner. I practiced what I would say until it was clean and short enough to hold under pressure. No anger, no theater, just fact. Saturday, I woke at 6, showered, shaved, put on clean jeans and a blue button-down shirt, the sort of thing I used to wear when meeting new clients who weren't sure yet whether they could trust me with their house. I ate toast and eggs. I set the folder Stephen had prepared on the kitchen counter and looked through it one final time. At 1:30, I stepped onto the porch. The October air had that clean edge mountain towns get when the leaves are half turned and every breeze smells faintly of wood smoke from somewhere else. The deputies arrived at 1:37. The older one introduced himself as Deputy Henson, late 50s, thick shoulders. The kind of composed face you only get by listening to family disputes for 20 years and deciding not to carry any of them home. His partner was younger and quieter and mostly there to provide the second uniform the law likes to see in uncertain situations. We went over the paperwork. I explained the likely scenario. Henson nodded, read the no trespass notice, then asked, "You want to do the talking?" "Yes." "We step in if he doesn't understand what no means." "That would be my preference." He gave me a look that suggested I had just said something he appreciated. At 2:10, I heard the truck before I saw it. Diesel engine, big box body, rental company logo on the side, then Miles's dark SUV behind it. They pulled up in front of my house with the calm slowness of people arriving at a place they think is already theirs. I was standing at the gate when Miles climbed out. He started toward the walk with his shoulders set and his mouth already shaped for explanation. Then he saw me. Then he saw the two deputies on the porch behind me. His stride changed. Not stopped. Changed. "What's this?" he said. He looked at the deputies, then at me. "What are you doing, Walt?" He called me Walt because I had told him years ago I preferred Walter, and some men hear boundaries as suggestions. I didn't answer him immediately. I handed the envelope to Deputy Henson. Henson stepped forward and extended it. "This is a notice of trespass," he said. "You are not permitted onto this property." Miles stared at the envelope like it was written in another language. Then he took it between two fingers and held it at his side without opening it. The passenger door of his SUV opened. Hannah stepped out. Sunglasses on, mouth tight. Then the truck doors opened. Richard came down slowly, favoring one leg. Paula followed, clutching a tote bag to her chest with both hands, confusion already gathering in her face. "Dad?" Hannah said. Her voice carried across the driveway and landed on me with more force than Miles's entire performance. "What's going on?" I turned and looked at my daughter. "Sweetheart," I said, keeping my voice level, "I never agreed to this. Your husband told me what was going to happen. He did not ask. When I said I would think about it, he treated that as permission. It was not." "That's not," Miles started. I held up one hand without looking at him. "Thinking about something is not the same thing as agreeing to it. And even if I had agreed at dinner, I have every right to change my mind before anyone steps into my house. This is my property. I decide who lives here." Miles's jaw tightened. He looked at Henson. "Can he do this?" Deputy Henson answered in the tone of a man explaining gravity. "Yes. He owns the property. He can deny entry. The notice you're holding makes that formal." "We drove up from Knoxville," Paula said. Her voice trembled in a way that would have moved me if the situation had not been manufactured around me without my consent. "We don't have anywhere else." I met her eyes. "I'm sorry you're in a difficult position, but whatever arrangement was made, it was made without my agreement. I am not the one who put you on this driveway with a truck." "You're turning away family," Miles said. His voice had dropped now, lower, harder. The reasonable man costume was beginning to split at the seams. "Your parents are family to you," I said. "Not to me by obligation, and even if they were, that would not give you the right to install them in my home without asking." He took a step toward the gate. The deputies moved almost imperceptibly, not threatening, just present. Miles saw it and stopped. The truck driver leaned his head out the open window and called, "You want me to wait or find somewhere to turn this thing around?" Nobody answered him. Hannah had walked a little closer now. She took off her sunglasses. Her eyes were wet. "Dad," she said, "they need help. Can't we just work something out?" That landed exactly where it was meant to, in the part of a parent that never fully hardens, no matter what good reasons it gives itself. But I had thought about this moment in my workshop the night before, the way I think through a difficult joint before I cut expensive wood. "Hannah," I said gently, "I love you. But what your husband did was decide he was entitled to my house before I had spoken. And you stood beside that decision without calling me once to ask what I wanted. That isn't working something out. That's deciding for me." She looked down. Miles said, "I want to speak to you privately. There is nothing to say privately that cannot be said here. 5 minutes. Just us." No. Deputy Henson did not need to add anything. His presence did it for him. For a second, I watched Miles recalculate. That was what men like him did when they hit resistance. Not reflect. Recalculate. "This isn't over," he said finally. I believed him. The truck driver called again, less patient now. Richard had lowered himself onto the rear bumper of the truck and sat there saying nothing at all. That was what stayed with me. Not outrage, not pleading. Just a slumped silence that made me wonder how much of this had been his plan and how much of it he had simply been carried into by other people's certainty. "Come on," Miles said to his parents. Paula stood in the street looking at my house for a long second. Then she looked at me and said, "You'll regret this." Deputy Henson cleared his throat once. "Ma'am, time to go." They loaded back into the SUV. The moving truck took an awkward three-point turn. Hannah stood in the driveway another beat longer, looking at me as if she could still not quite believe the world had not bent around her husband's expectation. Then she got in and followed them. The deputies waited until both vehicles were gone. Deputy Henson tucked his notebook into his breast pocket and said, "Clean as these things get." I thanked him. Thanked his partner, too. Watched the cruiser pull away. Then I stood alone in my driveway in the October air and looked at my house. The porch I had rebuilt. The swing I had hung. The workshop out back. Mine. The first voicemail came at 6:12 that evening. Miles. I let it go to voicemail and listened afterward. His voice was cold and clipped. He said I had humiliated his family in public. He said I had chosen property over people. He said I would see very clearly who my real family was the next time I needed anything from anyone. He used the word cruel 3 times. I saved the message. Then I created a folder in my phone labeled Documentation and wrote the time in my notebook. Over the next 15 days, 29 calls came in. I answered none of them. Miles left messages that changed shape without improving. First indignant, then aggrieved, then quietly threatening in that cowardly way men threaten when they want plausible deniability later. Once he said, "People who cut off family usually lose more than they expect." Once he said, "A house is just a house, Walter. You ought to think about what else can be taken." Once he said, "I hope that porch feels worth it." I saved everyone. Hannah called 9 times. Her messages were different, less certain, more confused. She said she just wanted to talk. She said she needed to understand why I had gone that far. She said she wished we had all handled it differently. She said in one message that sounded like she had been crying, "I didn't know he'd said things that way. I logged those too." 3 weeks later, certified mail arrived. I cut the envelope open at the kitchen table with the same brass letter opener Lila had bought me the Christmas Hannah turned 10. I read the complaint once, then again. Then I sat back and looked up at the kitchen ceiling I had replastered myself the year I moved in. Intentional infliction of emotional distress. Interference with familial support. Frank and Paula Carver were listed as injured parties. Miles and Hannah as co-plaintiffs. My daughter's name on a lawsuit against me. I called Stephen. He listened while I read parts of the complaint aloud. Then he sighed once and said, "Nuisance suit." That was my thought. Designed to pressure you into settlement or apology. It won't survive a decent motion, but we'll still have to kill it properly. Bring me every voicemail, every note, every time-stamped record. We met Thursday morning. I laid everything out on his conference table the way I used to lay out cabinetry specifications, labeled, chronological, cross-referenced, neat enough that a judge could follow it half asleep. Stephen read in silence for a long time. Then he looked up and said, "Your son-in-law is not as bright as he thinks he is. Because he left the voicemails? Because he left a trail. Smart people don't threaten in recordings. Smarter people don't do it after being warned by uniformed deputies." He filed a motion to dismiss with prejudice and a counterclaim for harassment. That night I sat alone in my workshop, not building anything, just sitting. Above my bench, I had an old photograph of Hannah pinned to the corkboard. She was maybe 11 in it, wearing one of my work aprons and a hard hat too large for her head, standing in the unfinished shell of a client's sunroom, grinning at the camera like she had framed the whole thing herself. I had brought her to job sites on school holidays. She had learned to read a tape measure before she could ride a bike without training wheels. She used to hand me finish nails and ask why some wood behaved better than other wood and why people always wanted bigger kitchens than they needed. I looked at that photograph for a long time. Then I unpinned it, turned it face down on the bench, and went back into the house to review the case file again. The hearing was set for January 17th. The weeks before, it settled into a grim rhythm. Discovery requests, financial disclosures, recorded messages, timelines. Frank and Paula's records showed they were receiving enough between Social Security and a small disability check to cover modest housing, especially with county assistance programs. Miles was earning more than he had implied. Hannah's salary at her planning firm had not been touched by his story at all. The emergency they had presented at my table dissolved quickly under paper. One evening in December, Hannah's old friend Nora called to ask if I was all right. That was how I learned Miles had been telling people at church that I had turned cold in retirement and was slipping mentally. I thanked Nora for the call and wrote that down too. By January, my notebook had become thick enough to feel like a brick. The courthouse was gray and cold the morning of the hearing. I wore my charcoal suit, the one I had last worn to Hannah's wedding and before that to Lila's funeral. There are some garments that spend their lives moving between vows and endings. Stephen met me on the steps with a travel mug of bad coffee and the sort of calm that only lawyers with strong paperwork achieve. Inside, the courtroom was exactly what courtrooms always are: fluorescent, wood-paneled, too warm, and faintly smelling of old carpet and old nerves. Miles arrived with Hannah and their attorney, a man in his 40s whose face told me he knew the weakness of what he had been paid to argue. Miles saw me and looked away. Hannah looked at the floor. The judge was a compact man in his 60s with silver hair and the expression of someone who had spent 20 years watching family disputes attempt to disguise themselves as legal principles. The plaintiff's attorney went first. He argued that I had promised shelter to vulnerable relatives and then withdrawn it in a humiliating and punitive manner. He said my refusal had caused demonstrable emotional suffering. He said the family relationship created an expectation of support. He used the word family so often it began to sound like a trick rather than a fact. Stephen stood when it was his turn and said, "Your Honor, the word family is being asked to perform a great deal of legal labor this morning. It cannot." Then he laid it out. No agreement, no lease, no consent. A direct refusal before entry. A lawful no trespass notice. A civil standby precisely because my client anticipated escalation. 29 follow-up calls. Multiple threatening voicemails. He played 3 of them. Hearing Miles's voice fill the courtroom was a strange experience. Threats that had seemed ugly in my kitchen sounded even uglier under fluorescent lights with a judge listening. At one point on the recording, Miles said, "You should think carefully about how people lose things when they cut off family." The judge stopped taking notes. That was when I knew the air had changed. Stephen then presented the financial documents, the incident report from the deputies, and the call log. The plaintiff's attorney tried to recover the case by context. Miles had been under stress. The language sounded worse isolated. Emotions had been high. The family dynamic was complicated. The judge looked down at the printed transcripts of the voicemails and then up at Miles. "Mr. Carver," he said, "do you dispute that these are your statements?" Miles leaned toward his attorney, whispered, then straightened. "No, Your Honor." The judge was silent for another minute. Then he set down his pen. "The claims of emotional distress and interference with family relations are dismissed," he said. "The plaintiffs have failed to establish any legal obligation on the part of the defendant. They have also failed to establish that the alleged hardship resulted from anything other than their own assumption." He glanced again at the voicemails. "The counterclaim for harassment has clearer footing. Counsel will proceed separately on that schedule. The defendant is awarded reasonable legal fees in the amount requested." Then he looked directly at Miles. "A homeowner's refusal to surrender occupancy of his own residence is not cruelty. It is ownership." That was it. Not dramatic, not loud, just final. Outside, on the courthouse steps, Stephen made notes for the next filing while I stood in the cold and let the air move through me. Miles left without a word. Hannah lingered. I heard her say my name before I turned. She looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep and everything to do with having something false break inside you. "I never heard those messages before today," she said. I waited. "He told me he tried to reason with you, that you refused to speak to him, that you hung up on him every time." I said nothing. She looked down at the steps. "He didn't tell me what he actually said." "When did you hear them for the first time?" I asked. "Just now." I nodded once. She looked up then. "I thought you had agreed that night and then changed your mind just to punish him. That's what he told me." "I never agreed," I said. "And this was never about punishing anyone. It was about a man deciding my answer for me before I had given one." Something in her face changed. Not repaired. Just shifted. The first movement of something real. "I'm sorry," she said. I did not tell her it was all right. It wasn't. But I told her, "I hear you." Then I walked to my car and drove home. The drive back to the house took 22 minutes. I made coffee when I got there, sat at my kitchen table, and let the quiet settle over the rooms. The case had gone exactly as Stephen predicted. Miles would likely get a civil finding for harassment. The legal fees would sting him. Good. But none of that was what I was sitting with. I was sitting with Hannah's face when she said she had heard those messages for the first time in the courtroom. 2 days later, I got a text from her. "Can we get coffee?" Just us. No agenda. I waited a full day before answering. Then I wrote, "Yes." We met at a diner on Brambleton Avenue the following Thursday. She was already there, hands around a coffee mug, looking out the window as if the parking lot might contain useful instructions. She looked like herself again in some small way. Not fully, but enough for me to feel it. I sat down. She started talking before the server reached us. Not defending, not bargaining, accounting for herself. She said she had spent the last 3 months telling herself I was being rigid, that retirement had made me territorial, that I was punishing Miles for older frictions neither of us had ever named. She said she had wanted those explanations to be true because the alternative was simpler and uglier, that she had stood in my driveway and backed a man who was wrong. I listened. I have always been better at listening than speaking. Carpentry and grief both reward silence more than noise. When she paused, I said the only true thing I knew to say. The part that hurt me was not Miles. I have dealt with difficult men my whole life. The part that hurt me was you. You stood beside him when he threatened me, even if you didn't hear every word, and you chose the easier story because it protected your marriage. She nodded. I know. We talked for almost 2 hours. About her marriage, which she admitted had been strained for longer than I knew. About the way Miles's certainty had once felt like strength and later felt more like occupation. About all the small decisions she had surrendered because it was easier not to argue with him than to keep proving she was a separate person. About the commute he had convinced her to leave behind. About the friends she saw less. About how often she had found herself defending things she never would have chosen on her own. She did not ask me to reconcile with him. She did not ask me to soften my position. She did not ask me to fix what she had broken. She just told the truth. When we stood to leave, she said, "Same time next week?" "Yes," I said. That was late January. Through February, I learned the shape of her life in pieces, carefully offered, not dumped. Her marriage had more cracks in it than the house dispute had created. The house had just put light through them. Richard and Paula had found a small apartment in Knoxville through a county support program. Richard's recovery was going well. Paula had gone back to full-time reception work. They were not thriving exactly, but neither were they stranded by my refusal the way Miles had presented. Miles himself continued acting as if paperwork could substitute for reflection. He sent one email through Hannah proposing what he called a practical rental arrangement, in which his parents would lease the upstairs rooms in my house at market rate. He wrote as if reframing coercion as a transaction made it sensible. I forwarded it to Stephen and deleted it. Hannah told me later that one of their marriage counselors had asked Miles to describe the events of the previous autumn from beginning to end. Listening to him tell it, she said, had been the moment she understood something clearly. He could not describe the story in a way that left room for anyone else's reality. He could only narrate himself as the injured party. She filed for separation in March. I drove her to her attorney's office on a wet Wednesday morning. We did not talk much on the way there. On the way back, she said, "I'm scared." "That's appropriate," I said. She laughed a little despite herself. It was the same laugh she had as a child when something was both true and unpleasant. The divorce took 4 months. Miles contested what he could, claimed outside influence, claimed estrangement, claimed my involvement had poisoned the marriage. Her attorney presented the court file from January, the voicemail transcripts, the civil finding on harassment, the driveway incident report. Facts do not shout. They just stand there until talk exhausts itself around them. By July, Hannah had moved into a one-bedroom apartment near downtown. I helped her carry boxes on a Saturday so hot the tape seals on the cardboard kept peeling loose. We built a bookshelf together that afternoon from a flat-pack kit and argued mildly over the instructions, which was the most ordinary thing we had done together in nearly a year. When we finished, she sat on her new couch and looked around the apartment. "It's small," she said. "It's yours," I told her. She nodded. "Yeah." By August, she had a rhythm. She went back to the planning firm where she had worked before Miles convinced her the drive wasn't worth it. She called twice a week. We met for coffee most Sundays. There was less apology in her now and more steadiness, which was better. One Sunday in early October, almost a year to the week from that dinner in my kitchen, she came over in the afternoon. We sat on the porch swing I had hung 3 autumns earlier and drank iced tea while the neighborhood moved quietly toward evening. A cardinal landed on the railing, regarded us both, and left. After a while, Hannah asked, "Have you thought about forgiving Miles?" I considered that honestly. Then I said, "I don't think I care enough about him anymore to need forgiveness. What he did was wrong. Consequences followed. That's the end of that chapter." She sat with that a minute. Then she said, "What about me?" I looked at my daughter, 35 years old, sitting on my porch in October, asking me a real question without trying to manage the answer. I told her, "I forgave you in February over bad diner coffee. The first morning you sat across from me and told the truth without rehearsing it first." She was quiet for a while. Then she said, "I should have called you that night, before any of it. I should have asked what you wanted instead of assuming." "Yes," I said. "You should have. You—" We sat with that too. A long time ago, I learned that the strongest joints in a house are not the ones never stressed. They are the ones built to carry weight honestly. Hannah turned her glass in her hands. I'm learning the difference, she said, between keeping the peace and just keeping quiet. They are not the same thing. No, she said. I know that now. I have thought about that whole year the way I think about an old renovation after the dust has settled and the furniture is back in place. Miles walked into my house and saw vacancy, extra rooms, unused square footage, potential. He did not see what those rooms actually were. The years of bids and bruised knuckles and Saturday work and back pain and grief and endurance that gave me the right to stand in my own kitchen and decide who crossed my threshold and who did not. You do not get to take that from a man. Not by demanding it. Not by dressing it up as family. Not by calling entitlement compassion. You especially do not get to take it from a man who has kept records his whole life and knows exactly what a threat sounds like when it gets left on voicemail. Richard and Paula, from what I heard later, settled into their apartment and found a sort of late calm. I never knew how much of that original move had been their wish and how much of it had been their son's solution to his own problem. I suspect the answer was not flattering to him. The first cool evening of October that year, after Hannah had driven home, I sat on my porch swing with a cup of coffee and watched the light change over the neighborhood. My house was quiet, every room exactly where it should be. The workshop out back where I still built things, not for clients now, but for myself, because some habits are too good to retire from completely. The kitchen I had retiled, the cabinets I had made. The porch swing I had hung because a man ought to have one good place to sit at the end of a day and know, without argument, that it belongs to him. A man spends his working life building things for other people. Kitchen remodels, porches, cabinets, additions, sunrooms, rooms where other people will eat and argue and age and forgive each other badly. You build them well because your name is on the work, because craft matters, because if a thing is worth doing, it is worth doing all the way. And if you are careful and work long enough and say no when no is required, you eventually build one place that is entirely yours. I had not won anything. That is not how I think of it. I had simply refused to surrender what I had earned to a man who thought the asking was the same thing as deserving. That isn't triumph. That is a minimum standard for a life. I finished my coffee. The first stars had started to show above the ridge line. Same time next Sunday, Hannah had said from the curb before driving away. Absolutely, I had told her. I went inside, locked the door, checked the cameras out of habit, then walked through the quiet rooms of my house, which was mine, which had always been mine, and which on that particular October evening felt exactly the size it was supposed to be.